Most people build their garden the wrong way and then spend the whole summer fighting problems they created with their own hands. They plant every vegetable in separate neat rows like little soldiers and then wonder why the cabbage gets eaten alive, why the tomatoes weaken in the heat, why the cucumbers stop producing in July, and why pests somehow always find their beds first. I used to do the exact same thing years ago, and honestly, I thought the answer was more fertilizer, stronger sprays, and more work. But the older I got, the more I noticed something strange. In nature, nothing grows alone. Out in old fields, near abandoned houses, along fence lines and forests, plants survive because they help each other. One plant hides another. One plant feeds another. One attracts insects that protect the whole area. And once I finally understood that simple thing, my garden changed completely. I stopped treating my beds like separate little islands and started building them like living neighborhoods where every plant had a job. That was when the pests got weaker, the soil stayed moist longer, and the harvest became steadier without spending extra money every week at the garden center. Most people still do not realize this. They think companion planting is just some old country tradition people talk about for fun. But old gardeners knew exactly what they were doing, because they watched plants for decades instead of reading labels on bottles. And today, I want to show you the combinations that completely changed how I grow food. Some of these pairs protect against insects. Some help roots grow stronger. Some cool the soil. Some attract beneficial insects that quietly patrol your garden day and night. And a few of them work so well together it almost feels like cheating once you see the results with your own eyes. I am going to walk you through 15 of the best plant partnerships I have personally seen work over the years, and I will also show you the mistakes most people still make when placing crops together, because one wrong neighbor can quietly ruin an entire season without you noticing until it is too late. So, before you plant another bed this year, you may want to hear what happened when I stopped growing vegetables separately and started letting them protect each other instead. The first pair that really opened my eyes was carrots and onions, because this one solves a problem that frustrates almost every gardener sooner or later. You spend weeks growing beautiful carrot tops, and then one morning, the roots are ruined by carrot fly larvae. Or your onions suddenly weaken and collapse because onion flies found them first. Most people think they need sprays for this, but the old gardeners handled it differently. They planted these crops together and let the smell do the work. Carrots and onions confuse each other's pests naturally because the strong onion smell masks the scent of carrots, and the carrot tops help hide the onions too. I started doing this many years ago after an older neighbor laughed at my perfectly separated rows and told me I was basically inviting pests to dinner. Since then, I almost never grow carrots alone anymore. I weave onions between them, and the difference is obvious by mid-season. The beds stay calmer and healthier without all the panic spraying people usually end up doing by July. Then there is tomatoes with basil, and honestly, this is probably one of the easiest combinations for beginners, because both plants already like the same warm conditions. But most people still miss how useful basil really is. It is not just for cooking. The smell from basil helps confuse pests around tomatoes, and many gardeners swear tomatoes taste richer when basil grows nearby. I cannot prove that part scientifically, but I can tell you the healthiest tomato beds I ever had always included basil underneath. The soil stayed shaded, insects bothered the plants less, and the whole area smelled alive in the evening heat. Another one people overlook is cucumbers with dill. Most gardeners harvest dill too early and never see its real value. Once dill flowers, it attracts tiny beneficial insects that quietly hunt pests all over your garden. Hoverflies, tiny wasps, ladybugs. You barely notice them working, but they patrol cucumber plants constantly. And cucumbers seem calmer around dill somehow. The vines stay productive longer, and the pollination improves because more insects visit the area. Very few people use dill this way anymore because modern gardening became obsessed with clean, empty beds instead of living systems. And the next partnership I am going to show you might be one of the strongest natural defenses against cabbage worms and soil pests I have ever seen in a small garden. Cabbage taught me one of the biggest lessons in gardening, because for years I fought cabbage worms like a losing war. Every summer the white butterflies arrived like clockwork, and within days the leaves looked shredded. I tried checking under leaves every morning. I tried picking worms by hand. Nothing really solved it until an old farmer showed me something so simple I almost felt stupid for missing it. He planted marigolds right through the cabbage bed instead of keeping flowers separate from vegetables. At first it looked messy to me, but by midsummer his cabbage stayed cleaner than mine without all the constant work. Marigolds help in two ways. Above ground, their smell confuses pests and discourages cabbage butterflies from settling comfortably. Underground, their roots help reduce nematodes in the soil, which quietly weaken plants without people realizing it. Ever since then, I stopped treating flowers like decoration and started treating them like workers in the garden. Nasturtiums do the same thing around zucchini and squash. Most people panic when aphids appear everywhere, but nasturtiums act like a trap. Aphids rush toward them first and often leave the vegetables alone. I actually want the aphids on those flowers because it keeps them away from more valuable crops. That is something modern gardening rarely teaches anymore. Sometimes you do not destroy the problem directly. Sometimes you redirect it. Another partnership I learned later was potatoes with cilantro. Now this one surprises people because they do not expect herbs to affect potato pests much, but cilantro has a strong scent that seems to confuse and disturb Colorado potato beetles. Is it perfect protection? No. Nothing in gardening is perfect. But when cilantro grows around potatoes, I consistently notice less damage and fewer beetles settling comfortably. And then there is strawberries with garlic, which became one of my favorite combinations after a rainy season nearly wiped out my berry patch years ago. Wet summers bring gray mold fast, and once it spreads through strawberries, the harvest collapses quickly. Garlic helps because its strong smell and natural compounds discourage fungal problems and also bother weevils that damage berries. I plant garlic around the edges and between rows now, and the patch stays healthier and easier to manage. What most people still do not understand is this. A smart garden is not built from one miracle trick. It is built from many small protections working quietly together all season long. And once those layers begin working together, the entire garden starts feeling stronger with much less effort from you. But there are a few plant combinations that work even deeper than pest control, because they actually help feed and support each other underground, and that is where things get really interesting. One thing I noticed after many years is that the strongest gardens are usually the ones where plants help each other below the soil and not just above it. Most people only think about what they can see: leaves, insects, weeds. But underground, there is another world happening all the time, and once you understand that part, your harvest changes fast. Take eggplants with bush beans, for example. Eggplants are heavy feeders and they pull a lot from the soil during summer heat. Beans, on the other hand, quietly help return nitrogen to the ground through bacteria around their roots. So when you grow bush beans near eggplants, the soil stays more balanced and the eggplants keep producing longer instead of fading early from exhaustion. I learned this from an older gardener who said hungry plants should never eat alone if you want steady harvests. At first I doubted him, but after trying it myself I saw the difference by late August when most eggplants normally start slowing down. Another combination I now use constantly is lettuce with radishes. This one is simple but incredibly useful, especially during hot summers. Radishes grow quickly and break up the surface soil, while lettuce spreads low and shades the ground. Together, they help trap moisture and keep the soil cooler. Most people lose lettuce early because the roots overheat and dry too fast. But tucked beside radishes, the leaves stay softer and less bitter much longer. Very few people still grow lettuce this way because everyone became obsessed with perfect straight rows instead of practical growing. Corn with peas is another old partnership that almost disappeared from modern gardens. Corn acts like a living support for peas, while peas help feed nitrogen back into the soil around the corn roots. Instead of building extra structures and buying materials, You let the plants help each other naturally. I still remember seeing this in an older family garden years ago and realizing people solved problems with plant partnerships long before plastic trellises filled every garden store. Peppers with oregano work beautifully too, especially during dry, hot weather. Oregano spreads low across the soil, almost like a living mulch. It shades the ground, helps trap moisture, and its strong smell discourages aphids from settling comfortably around pepper plants. And then there is pumpkin with sunflower, which surprised me the first time I saw it. Tall sunflowers help reduce harsh overheating on pumpkin leaves during brutal summer afternoons, while pumpkins shade the ground underneath and hold moisture around the roots. One protects from above, and one protects from below. That is the part most people miss completely. A healthy garden is not random plants crowded together. It is a system where every crop quietly performs a job that supports the others around it. And the next few combinations might be some of the smartest examples of that idea I have ever used in my own garden. One partnership that almost nobody around me used when I was younger was beets with celery, and honestly, I ignored it for years because it sounded too simple to matter. But after one difficult season with dry, compacted soil, I finally tried it, and the difference surprised me more than I expected. Celery has shallow, thirsty roots and keeps the upper soil active with regular moisture, while beets push deeper and seem to benefit from the softer, cooler ground nearby. The growth becomes steadier for both plants, and the beets stay more tender instead of turning woody during hot stretches. It is not some miracle trick. That is important to understand. Most old methods work quietly, not dramatically. You notice them slowly through stronger leaves, steadier growth, and fewer problems piling up by midsummer. Grapes with mustard are another combination old growers understood well long before modern sprays became common everywhere. Mustard helps reduce fungal pressure in the soil and improves biological activity around grape roots. Some older gardeners even chop the mustard down and leave it on the surface as a kind of natural protective layer. I started trying this after losing part of a grape harvest during a damp season when fungus spread fast through the vines. Since then, I pay much more attention to what grows underneath fruiting plants because bare dead soil usually creates more trouble than living soil ever does. Tomatoes with calendula are another powerful pair people often underestimate because calendula looks too simple to matter. But beneath the soil, its roots help reduce nematode pressure, and above ground, the flowers attract pollinators and beneficial insects into the tomato bed. The entire area becomes more active and balanced. Most people only focus on feeding tomatoes heavily, but forget that stressed roots create weak plants no matter how much fertilizer gets poured onto the bed. And this is where many gardeners still make expensive mistakes. They hear about companion planting, and then randomly jam everything together without planning. That creates competition instead of support. One thing I learned the hard way is you cannot place two hungry, heavy-feeding crops side by side and expect peace. Tomatoes beside giant pumpkins, for example, usually become a fight for nutrients and water. Another mistake is ignoring plant height. Tall crops can accidentally block sunlight from smaller plants that desperately need warmth and full light. And probably the biggest mistake of all is planting close relatives together. Crops from the same family often share the same diseases and pests. Tomatoes, peppers, potatoes, and eggplants may seem comfortable together, but when trouble starts, it spreads through all of them much faster. Most people only realize this after disease suddenly races through an entire bed. And there is one final principle that changed the way I plan every garden now, because once you understand it, the whole space starts working more like nature itself, instead of against it. The biggest change happened when I stopped trying to control every little problem in the garden and started building balance instead. That is really what all these plant partnerships are doing underneath everything else. They create stability. When onions hide carrots, when basil protects tomatoes, when flowers pull in beneficial insects, when ground cover shades roots and traps moisture, the garden slowly becomes stronger on its own. You stop running outside every morning looking for disaster because the system starts protecting itself before problems explode. I noticed this especially during difficult summers when heat stayed brutal for weeks and other gardens nearby started struggling badly. Beds built with smart plant partnerships stayed cooler, held moisture longer, and recovered faster after stress. The plants were not isolated anymore. They were supporting each other like a real living system. One year, I remember walking through my garden after several days of intense dry wind and seeing something that honestly changed how I think about gardening forever. The beds with mixed planting still looked calm. The soil underneath stayed damp. Pollinators were moving everywhere. The leaves held their color better. Meanwhile, nearby, empty single-crop rows looked tired and exposed. That was the moment I fully understood why old gardeners planted the way they did. They were not being messy or old-fashioned. They were copying nature because nature already solved many of these problems long ago. Most modern gardening tries to force control onto the garden with sprays, products, and endless corrections after something goes wrong. But older methods focused more on prevention through balance and smart placement from the beginning. And honestly, for people our age, that matters a lot because most of us do not want to spend every day fighting pests, dragging hoses around, or buying expensive treatments all summer long. We want gardens that feel peaceful, productive, and manageable. That is why these old planting partnerships matter so much. They save time, they reduce waste, they lower stress, and over time they build healthier soil that gets easier to work with instead of harder every season. The beautiful part is you do not need to redesign your entire garden overnight. Even adding just 2 or 3 smart combinations this season can completely change how your beds behave by midsummer. Once you see it happen with your own eyes, it becomes very hard to go back to growing everything separately again. And there is one final thing I always tell people before they start planning their next garden, because this single mindset shift may matter even more than every companion planting trick we talked about today. The longer I garden, the more I realize a healthy garden behaves less like a factory and more like a family. Every plant affects the others around it, whether we notice it or not. Some protect, some feed, some attract life, some create shade and hold moisture when the heat becomes unbearable. And once you begin planting with that idea in mind, the entire space changes its feeling. The garden becomes calmer, stronger, easier to manage. You stop chasing problems all summer because many of them never fully appear in the first place. That does not mean you will never lose a plant again because nature always keeps us humble. But it does mean the garden becomes more forgiving and more stable year after year. I think many people today have simply forgotten how powerful simple observation can be. Old gardeners did not have shelves full of products or endless internet advice. They watched which plants thrived together and which ones struggled. They learned slowly through seasons, failures, weather, insects, and patience. And honestly, some of those forgotten lessons are still more useful than half the expensive solutions sold today. If you remember only one thing from this video, let it be this. Do not build your garden as isolated crops fighting alone for survival. Build it like a living neighborhood where every plant serves a purpose. Let flowers protect vegetables. Let herbs confuse pests. Let taller plants shelter weaker ones from brutal heat. Let roots work together underground instead of competing constantly. Once you start thinking that way, even a small backyard garden begins feeling alive in a completely different way. This year, when you plan your beds, maybe try just a few of these partnerships first. Plant onions through your carrots. Slide basil under your tomatoes. Add marigolds beside cabbage. Let dill flower near cucumbers. Watch what changes quietly over the season, because the results usually appear little by little until one day you suddenly realize you are spraying less, watering less, worrying less, and harvesting more. That is when gardening becomes truly enjoyable again, especially later in life when peace and simplicity matter more than perfection. And honestly, there are still many forgotten planting tricks most people never hear about anymore. Some old combinations improve flavor. Some protect soil through winter. Some even help damaged gardens recover naturally after years of exhaustion. I may share those in another video because one of the oldest companion planting methods I ever learned completely transformed how I grow beans and corn together, and almost nobody uses it anymore today.